Leading Ideas Talks podcast is brought to you by the Lewis Center for Church Leadership of Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C. Subscribe free to our weekly e-newsletter, Leading Ideas, at churchleadership.com/leadingideas. Leading Ideas Talks is also brought to you by Leading the Church in a Post-Pandemic Culture, a new Doctor of Ministry and Church Leadership focus from Wesley Theological Seminary and the Lewis Center for Church Leadership. With this track, clergy will receive the enhanced knowledge, skills, and motivation to increase congregational and denominational service, vitality, and growth in the post-pandemic world. Learn more and apply by February 15th for May 2023 at churchleadership.com/dmin. And remember, to stay up to date with the latest church leadership strategies and information, please like and subscribe to this channel and click the bell icon to get updates for new videos. How can church leaders address conflicts? In this episode, we speak with attorney and mediator Charlie Pillsbury about mediating conflicts in congregations.
Welcome to Leading Ideas Talks, a podcast featuring thought leaders and innovative practitioners. I am Jessica Anschutz, the Assistant Director of the Lewis Center for Church Leadership, and I am your host for this Leading Ideas Talk. Joining me is Charlie Pillsbury, an attorney, mediator, and co-director of the Center on Dispute Resolution at Quinnipiac University School of Law. Welcome, Charlie. I'm grateful for your willingness to share some of your conflict mediation wisdom with our listeners. I look forward to our conversation today. I want to start off by inviting you to share a little bit about your background in conflict mediation.
Well, sure. First of all, I graduated from law school in 1975. So the law is certainly a form of dispute resolution. And I practiced law for a dozen years, and I was a good lawyer, but it didn't feed me. And I went through kind of what I call a vocational nervous breakdown. And in that process, I had also joined an organization called the Christian Legal Society. It's a very evangelical, conservative Christian organization, and I don't agree with it on everything, but I am always impressed with people who take their faith seriously 7 days a week, not just 1 day a week. And it was actually through that I discovered this symposium called the Ministry of Reconciliation in Lombard, Illinois, at Wheaton College, the alma mater of Billy Graham. And I was curious because it was inviting lawyers, mediators to come out and look at it through a scriptural lens. And I had never really thought of it that way. And so I went, and of course I was, there were maybe another 2 or 3 other people from mainline churches. It was all evangelicals or a lot of Mennonites, brethren, peace churches. It was really kind of an Alice in Wonderland experience for me. And so I go back to New Haven, and literally within a week, I learned about this community mediation program. And at that point, I lived in New Haven for a dozen years and was very well tuned in. I chaired the Columbus House homeless shelter. I was very active in my church, and I'd never heard of this little sleepy mediation program in the Fairhaven neighborhood of New Haven. And they had a training, and I couldn't make it that summer. That was the summer of 87. So really the following year, I did a 15-hour training in those days and became a mediator, volunteer mediator. And at the same time, I had gone back to the Yale Divinity School, another way to, as a special student, to get not an MDiv, but an MAR. And I was partway through that and had created this internship with this mediation program because the director of the program at the time was a UCC pastor. So it was easy to set up as a internship site, field placement, and I hadn't been there more than a month or two when my placement director, my supervisor, announced that she was retiring. And I'm saying, God, what am I going to do now? I mean, and then I said, oh, I know, I can apply for her job. So that's what I did. I was hired, and for the next 20 years, it was really the best job I ever had, and probably will ever have, was as the executive director of a community mediation center in New Haven. And we did more than mediation. We actually created a dialogue program with churches, actually around kind of the Rodney King incident of New Haven, when a young Black man was slain by an East Haven police officer. For the last 13 years, I figured 20 years is a good run. I don't want to overstay my welcome, and I started teaching as an adjunct at Quinnipiac, and now they call me the distinguished practitioner in residence. I love talking about the scriptural foundations of my journey, my vocational journey, because I think it was spirit led, and here I am talking to you now about some of that.
Wonderful. What an incredible background you have in our topic area. I feel like we're not going to have enough time today to cover all of the possibilities that we could talk about. But going back to your point about scripture informing what you do, how does scripture inform your approach to dispute resolution?
Well, first of all, I was drawn to the ministry of reconciliation. And you probably remember one of my professors at the Yale Divinity School and at the School of Religious Studies, Wayne Meeks, a New Testament scholar, not one for small talk, came up to me after a service at Battelle Chapel and asked me, Charlie, do you experience, is there, knowing what I did, is there some tension between the ministry of reconciliation and the ministry of justice? And I said, absolutely. I feel like I live on that tight wire. I mean, that's what this is. It's a ministry of reconciliation, but it's also a ministry of justice. But there are other people who do justice better than I do, and I think I do reconciliation better than most. So that's my path. And when I went to this program, the symposium, I learned that actually it was being organized by a Lombard Mennonite Peace Center. So of course it was the Mennonites. The Mennonites are everywhere in this ministry of reconciliation. And Richard Blackburn was then the director. And the two pieces of scripture that they drew on was first that passage from Matthew 18, where what you do when a brother sins against you. You go talk to your brother, and if they don't listen to you, then you take one or two people as witnesses to talk. And if that doesn't work, then you take it to the whole church. And I think that many scholars view that it led to the shunning, to the expelling of a person from treat them like a tax collector or a Gentile. They got kicked out of their community. But I was struck the way that it was used, because actually I looked at that passage enough, and it's framed by, you look, that pericope is framed by two amazing passages of forgiveness on either side, including how many times should I forgive my brother? 7 times? No, 7 times, 77 times. And the other passage they used was the passage from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. I remember that well, because that's where Paul is totally exasperated with the Corinthian church. Because if any church has conflict, I don't think any church compares to what the conflict that the early Christians had at the Corinthian church, where they were fighting over everything, what to eat, what to wear on their heads, who to believe in. Anyway, it was, but Paul, just at one point in exasperation, I'm sure, said, isn't there anybody, I guess what happens is that somebody sues each other. They actually, two members of the church are suing each other. And of course, it's now going to the Greek courts, and these are pagan courts. And Paul is saying, what are you doing? Airing your dirty laundry in pagan courts? Isn't there anybody wise enough among you to settle this matter? Basically, it was a call for churches to take seriously how churches resolve their own conflicts. Whether it's a congregation-wide conflict or individual conflict. So it was those. I'd say that's where it begins. But then, of course, I love I have a whole series of sacred stories. I haven't done yet one on the Matthew. I've done one on the Paul passage and on other passages. My favorite is probably the reconciliation between Esau and Jacob after Jacob crosses the Jabbok River. And
we will link to your sacred stories in our bio on our podcast page so our listeners can check those out. In thinking about your approach to dispute resolution, Charlie, when a conflict occurs in a church, what strategies can church leaders use to address it?
Matthew 18 is a guide. I mean, the first step in any conflict is direct communications. What happens in churches, what happens everywhere is people triangulate. And they start talking about, this person did that. If you're upset, talk to that person. That's the first principle of conflict resolution. The second, really, that people forget is that people are not the problem. We turn people into the problem, but that's, and again, not a fundamental principle of conflict resolution. The problem is the problem. So how do you separate a person? Maybe the person was having a bad day. Let's deal with the problem. Give the person a chance to explain what happened. So I think those are the two. That's where you begin. What I'd like to say about churches, maybe answering another question, is there are two types of conflicts. They're really conflicts among individuals. One of the most common you see, of course, is a male senior pastor and a female junior associate pastor. Might be between the pastor and the board. That's a bigger conflict, but it could also be something that's engulfed the whole church. And then there's a limit to what mediation can do. Mediation is very good at seeking agreements, helping people reach an agreement about a specific issue, a specific problem. But when you have a broader problem, you may want to turn to dialogue and approach it with a neutral facilitator. I can't say how important it is when you go to that level, not for somebody within the church who thinks they can be neutral in the middle of a congregation-wide. That's just a fundamental error. Even sometimes when you're doing a long-range plan, you should get an outside somebody who's neutral who can help you guide you through a long-range planning process. But even to deal with a conflict, and because what that person can do is they can go talk to the people who before they bring everybody together, they're going to do their homework and they're going to talk to the people who are most involved in that conflict, who know most about it, before they bring people together. So it's use a neutral. Don't I think pastors make mistakes, even if they're trained mediators. If they do disputes within, you can dispute. You can go to help your next door, the church next door, solve a dispute. But in your own church, there's no way you can be neutral and impartial. It just simply is. So, my little sermon on conflict resolution.
I think it's a very important wisdom for people to take in mind, especially when they're addressing conflicts in their context. One of the things I experienced as a pastor was often conflicts that would arise in the context of a meeting. And I'm wondering if you have some thoughts on how church leaders can sort of mitigate and interrupt those moments, experiences, and move through them in an effective way.
Well, the foundation for any dispute, whether it's a mediation or a dialogue, in the meeting you're talking about facilitated dialogue, there's a moderator, there's someone who's chairing the meeting. The group has to have a set of ground rules. In a church setting, we call it a covenant, an agreement of how we're going to interact with each other, how we're going to talk with each other. We're going to talk about ourselves. We're not going to talk about other people. We're not going to interrupt each other. We're not going to call each other names. And unless you have those ground rules, which everyone has agreed to. And at one point, I'm doing this uh, dialogue training, and I realized that at community mediation, we did not have ground rules. And I realized we have to practice what we preach. And it actually took us, mediators can have arguments too. It took us, I think, 4 or 5 months to agree on a set of ground rules. But once you have that foundation, then who's ever facilitating the meeting can remind people. In fact, it's useful to remind people at the beginning of the meeting. Here are our ground rules, and so and that is a meeting facilitator's best friend. The second thing, aside from ground rules, is that every meeting has to have an agenda. A lot of people try to wing it. You want a timed agenda, and so part of it, you can also use time. Say, we're spending a lot of time on this issue. Maybe we need to talk about it outside the meeting. Maybe we need to talk about it after the meeting. We have other things on our agenda, but and that agenda should be shared with everybody. Everybody should know what it is, and then whoever's facilitating, can follow the agenda. Sometimes what I do is I give myself a timed agenda as the facilitator of a meeting, and I don't time it for the people, because they get we're already 5 minutes past. We've been let me as the facilitator kind of manage the time. So I call it a private agenda, a public agenda, but ground rules and agendas are help keep the peace in meetings, whether it's church meetings, office meetings, family meetings.
Absolutely. And I can see how they would limit conflict in a lot of cases. Sometimes in churches, conflict stems from negativity and pushback, either from church members or church staff members. What can church leaders do to address that?
Again, I think they need to talk to each person individually. People begin with their positions, but the positions are just kind of that's the first thing that comes out. That's their first story, and part of it is to, I guess even more important than being trained in mediation. If you haven't had an opportunity to be trained in something called active listening or compassionate listening, there are multiple ways of doing that. But it is really hard to listen well. You can't listen well all the time. To listen well, you have to be on, and it's in those down moments sometimes that you say things that you didn't mean to say. If you have that skill, you can first of all reflect back. Okay, so you're really upset about this, but why are you upset? You want to get underneath that position. What does this person need? What's going on underneath? Why have they staked themselves? Why have they kind of anchored themselves to this position? What's it doing for them? What need is it meeting? What's going on? And to give you the simplest example of one of my favorite examples of the difference between a position and an interest is an actual case that happened in the New Haven Fire Department in a fire station, and the dispute was over whether the light should be on or the light should be off on the second floor where everybody sleeps. And there were firefighters in the fire station fighting with each other about whether the light should be on or the light should be off, and it ended up on the chief's desk. And I was talking to him, and he said, these are the kind of things that don't need to end up on my desk. We have to figure out how to train firefighters. So we did training, and what I learned about training firefighters is, unlike police, the conflicts they have is with the citizens. Firefighters have conflict with each other. That's where they have the conflict. And so there they want lights on, lights off. Why do they want the lights on? Well, of course, one side wants the lights on because they wanted to see where the pole was. They don't want to get up in the middle of the night and miss the pole. They got to get down the pole. Why do other people want the lights off? Because they want to sleep. They don't like sleeping with the lights on. You need to get these firefighters talking about how are we going to figure this problem? This is our problem. It's make them own the problem and make them figure it out, but help them get below their positions to what they need and what they want. And So I think that applies really in any setting.
I can certainly see that applying in churches. And if you get stuck in your position, you may lose sight of possible solutions that would resolve the conflict.
I'm trying to remember, there's a wonderful rabbi, I think Rabbi Friedman, now deceased, who wrote a book, I think about from generation to generation. It goes back many years. But you know, he basically was trained as a family therapist. And he was a rabbi and a family therapist. And he began to see the disputes inside his congregation mimic some of the disputes he saw in family settings. And so, I recommend that book.
In thinking about opportunities for education, how can church leaders cultivate conflict mediation skills? Are there other ways in addition to attending trainings or workshops?
Well, they can model. They can model that. I mean, you know, um, uh, you know, what people really want, anybody wants, and pastors know this better than lawyers. They want to be heard. So I think you can model that, and maybe uh, you know, mediation training. That you want to function as a neutral. Most people are not neutral, so they don't need mediation training. But I do think if they're sometimes it's mediation centers, but maybe other, just training and listening skills. How do you listen to people? So those are 2-hour workshops. I actually remember doing a workshop. This was um, trying to help a group of pastors understand that there's a difference between when you say, people will say, "I feel that she's stupid," and I'm saying, "No, that's not what you feel. That's what you think." How do you that's a thought. That's not a feeling. So part of it is, active listening is understanding feelings and what they are and trying to surface those feelings. And that's what, learning to interact and ask open-ended questions. How did that happen? Or how did we get here? Tell me what happened. An open-ended question, kind of open things up and let people just talk and separate the facts from the feelings. It sounds like this is the issue, but you're really feeling very sad about this. I mean, this is you're in grief. You feel like you've lost a relationship, and that's hard. So people need to be heard at two levels. They need to be heard at the fact level and at the feeling level, and that's a skill that I don't think enough pastors get when they're in school, frankly. But maybe they do. Maybe the seminary education has changed since I was there, so 30 years ago.
I think that's a really important distinction between fact and feeling, and something that we probably need to pay more attention to. Charlie, you've mentioned a couple of times the importance of involving a third party when a conflict exists. Can you speak more about that, about how folks can recognize when it is time to engage the third party?
Well, I think when it's time is when it's whatever you're doing is not working. Sometimes churches make the mistake of thinking that they can do their own long-term planning. I think you really need a facilitator there too. The resource that many communities can turn to is our local mediation centers, where there are trained mediators and facilitators. And the way they can connect with that is that there's an organization called the National Association for Community Mediation. And I think the website is just nafcm.com or .org. I think it's it's a nonprofit. But you can go to where you live and what's the nearest center to you. There are some mediation wastelands and churches and synagogues and mosques everybody thinks that God or Jehovah or Allah is on their side. That's really tricky. When you think God's on your side, because there's a famous Mark Twain poem about everybody during the Civil War about the North and the South praying to the same God, yeah, who of course loves everybody. And how ridiculous that was. Even Mark Twain got the hint. So,
how can faith leaders address that issue of people thinking God is on their side?
well, I think by pointing out that God is on everybody's side. I mean, the notion that coaches are out praying for their teams on, now it goes to the Supreme. I mean, come on, God's not taking sides. God's is laughing at you. If you think that God is going to take sides in your football game, you got to look at your theology. So I think that making that point, which is so obvious, but that's a position again. God's on my side. That's your position. What's really going on? What's really upsetting you? I mean, what can we do? Because God, the Spirit works through all of us. So how can we channel that Spirit to, because really it's not God, it's the Holy Spirit that really at work in these matters that work, and you can feel it sometimes. I would also begin in any setting, maybe even before you have ground rules and an agenda. You start with an opening prayer and a closing prayer. You got to frame this. This is a church meeting. We're calling in the Holy Spirit to work with all of us to help us, stick to our ground rules and get through our agenda and love each other even if we don't like each other. And so prayer is good too.
I think that's an important reminder to frame our work in the context of our faith.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for taking the time, Charlie, to talk with me today. As we conclude, I want to invite you to share one or two or three thoughts that for people who are in the midst of conflict right now, what should they look to do as initial steps?
Before you try to even get together, you should go talk to somebody. You should talk to somebody. You should talk to the pastor. You should talk to your therapist. You should talk to your social worker. You should, you could show whoever it is. I think, you need to take care of yourself. And conflict is draining, and it's hurtful, and so each party really has to find ways to care for themselves. And sometimes I think people going through difficult points in their marriage or difficult points, often told by their therapists or their pastoral counselors, you need to get your own. It's not enough just come to see me, the two of you together. You really need to talk to somebody else. This is a really deep issue for you, more than we're going to be able to handle. And I recommend that the other person do the same. You don't want to be even-handed, but get help. Talk to somebody you trust. I'll leave people with this. I'm a Minnesotan, born and bred there. In Minnesota, we say there's no such thing as bad weather, only bad clothing. That's the same thing is true in conflict. Conflict is not bad. There's no such thing as bad conflict. Conflict is good. Conflict gives us an opportunity to learn. But conflict just is. It's like the weather. And so it's how you handle the weather, it's how you handle the conflict that matters. And so that's what I just say. It's conflicts are opportunities. So look at conflict as an opportunity to learn, to become closer to somebody, to understand somebody. I mean, just to look at it positively, frame it positively.
The importance of self-care in all aspects of ministry, and thank you for drawing that connection to conflict resolution. Charlie, thanks so much for joining us today. It's been a joy to talk with you. I'm sure what you have shared here today will help our listeners as they address the conflicts in their context.
Well, thank you, Jessica. It's wonderful to see you again, and have your email pop up and to have this opportunity to connect at least via Zoom. Yeah, and I'm happy to talk to anybody if they want to talk some more. So you have my contact information, and please feel free to share it.
Thanks for joining us for Leading Ideas Talks. Please like and subscribe to this channel and click the bell icon to get updates for new videos.